What if the deepest hole ever dug into a mountain still isn't deep enough? Somewhere in Iran right now, engineers are betting their entire nuclear program on the answer being no. If a story about the actual physics of underground warfare sounds interesting to you, hit subscribe, tap like, and send this to the one friend who always asks how bunker busters actually work. For nearly 20 years, Iran's entire defense strategy has rested on a single, simple bet. Bury it deep enough, and nothing above ground can ever touch. Hit. Not airstrikes, not sanctions, not diplomacy. Just solid rock, hundreds of feet thick, sitting between the outside world and whatever matters most underneath. That bet has now been tested, again and again, in real combat, against some of the most advanced weapons the United States has ever built. And the honest answer, once you look at everything together, isn't the simple headline you'd expect either way. This isn't really a story about tunnels and craters. It's a story about a 20-year wager between depth and precision, and about what happens when a country keeps digging deeper every single time its enemy proves it can reach a little further down. Let's walk through exactly how that wager has played out, because the real picture is a lot messier and a lot more interesting than either side of this conflict wants you to believe. Let's start with the weapon that basically defined this entire chapter of the story. For more than a decade, American engineers worked on a bunker-busting bomb built around one specific problem, a uranium enrichment facility buried deep inside a mountain, constructed specifically to survive exactly this kind of attack. The bomb that eventually came out of that program was massive, tens of thousands of pounds, built with a hardened casing designed to punch through enormous amounts of solid rock before it even detonates. It doesn't rely on a giant blast radius the way older weapons do. It relies on pure momentum, driving straight down through everything in its path, before triggering a delayed explosion once it's already inside the structure it's aiming for. Guidance comes from a mix of satellite positioning and internal navigation, which keeps it accurate even in contested airspace where signals might get jammed. Only one aircraft in the world is currently certified to carry it, and each one of those aircraft can carry two at a time. In the middle of last year, that bomb got its first real combat test. A handful of stealth bombers flew a long-range mission, dropping over a dozen of these massive penetrators on two heavily fortified nuclear sites, while dozens of cruise missiles struck a third location's surface infrastructure at the same time. Iran's own nuclear authorities confirmed at the time that all three sites had been hit. That mission was proof of concept. It was the moment a 15-year engineering theory turned into a demonstrated operational capability. There's a quieter follow-up to that story that most people never really heard about, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Early this year, the same type of stealth bombers, this time carrying smaller 2,000-pound bombs, struck another site long linked to earlier weapons-related research, allegations Iran has always firmly denied. Analysts comparing the damage at this newer site to the craters left behind at the earlier strikes found the patterns strikingly similar. When reporters asked American military officials directly whether the heaviest bunker busters had been used there too, officials declined to say either way. What makes this particular site interesting isn't just the strike itself, it's the fact that it had already been hit once before, years earlier, and then hit again during an even earlier round of fighting. And each time, Iran quietly rebuilt key parts of it. 3 strikes on the same coordinates, across 3 different years, by 2 different air forces, and each time, the site came back. That's not really a story about a single weapon failing to do its job. It's a story about exactly how much national will it takes to rebuild the same facility 3 separate times, and about what that kind of persistence tells you regarding how much value a country's leadership still places on whatever that site was actually built for. Bury it, get hit, rebuild, get hit again. That loop has quietly repeated itself across site after site, all the way up through the most recent reporting available right now. But here's where most retellings of this story stop, right at the nuclear sites. And that's exactly where the far more interesting part of the story actually keeps going. Because Fordo wasn't the end of this underground fight. It was really only the opening chapter. When the current phase of this war escalated further, the underground question didn't fade into the background. It got significantly bigger. That's because Iran doesn't just bury its nuclear program deep underground. It buries its entire missile force the exact same way. Analysts have described what they call Iran's underground missile cities, enormous tunnel networks packed with ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, and mobile launch vehicles, all connected together by transport corridors that let weapons move around completely out of sight until the exact moment they're actually needed. Experts who study these networks closely say the real challenge was never finding the tunnel entrances themselves, since a lot of them are actually visible from ordinary satellite imagery. The real challenge is that an entrance and the actual storage chamber it eventually leads to can sit hundreds of meters apart underground, connected by corridors deliberately carved to prevent a single strike on one entrance from ever reaching everything stored deeper inside. Iran even released its own footage earlier in this conflict, showing rows of attack. Drones and rockets lined up deep inside one of these tunnels, launch vehicles parked in the dark, simply waiting for an order to move. So American forces went back to work. Under a separate operation focused specifically on these missile networks, stealth bombers dropped dozens of smaller penetrator bombs on deeply buried ballistic missile launch sites. These were noticeably smaller than the massive Fordo-class weapon, built more for repeated, high-volume strikes against hardened missile infrastructure than for a single mountain-collapsing hit all at once. Not long after, the campaign escalated again, with senior military officials confirming that forces had dropped a newer, roughly 5,000-pound penetrator weapon into underground storage sites holding coastal defense missiles near a critical regional waterway. That strike reportedly marked the combat debut of that exact weapon, one specifically designed, according to officials, to punch through concrete and rock and still function properly once it was actually inside the target. Here's a detail worth genuinely sitting with for a second. That newer weapon was built specifically to replace a much older bunker buster that had been in service since the early 1990s. Think about that gap, roughly 3.5 decades between one generation of penetrator bomb and the next. And the very first time this newer version ever gets used in actual combat is against exactly this kind of underground Iranian missile storage. That's not really a coincidence. That's a weapon sitting quietly in reserve for years, essentially waiting for exactly this kind of target to finally show up. It's worth zooming out for a moment on the broader inventory question here, too, because these weapons aren't unlimited. Reporting has indicated that the Air Force placed new orders specifically to replenish its stock of the heaviest bunker busters, after the earlier strikes had used up a meaningful share of what had been built up over previous years. That single fact tells you something important about how seriously military planners are treating this entire mission going forward. Maintaining an active stockpile of the heaviest conventional bunker buster on the planet isn't cheap, and choosing to keep replenishing it, rather than treating those earlier strikes as a one-time historical event, signals that hardened underground targets are now viewed as a permanent, ongoing planning problem, not just something specific to this one country. If a breakdown this detailed is actually useful to you, this is a genuinely good moment to hit subscribe, because we're only about 1/3 of the way into the part of this story that really matters. Drop a comment telling me which detail surprised you most so far. Now let's get to the part of this whole story that I think matters more than any single individual bomb, because it's the part that actually answers the real question underneath all of this. Did the United States prove that buried weapons genuinely aren't safe anymore? Or did it end up proving something considerably messier than that? South of one particular Iranian city sits a mountain missile complex that became, according to multiple reports, one of the single most heavily bombed strategic locations of the entire war. Stealth bombers and long-range heavy bombers repeatedly struck it, targeting entrances, storage chambers, launch infrastructure, and buried logistics corridors roughly 20 separate times across the conflict. Satellite imagery, reviewed by multiple independent commercial providers, showed collapsed tunnel entrances, scorched mountain surfaces, and extensive crater patterns spreading across the entire region. Several of those strikes reportedly triggered secondary explosions, the exact kind you only get when a bomb actually reaches stored missile fuel or ammunition sitting somewhere inside the mountain. By every visible measure available from the outside, that looks like genuine devastation. If you only ever saw the satellite photographs and stopped right there, you'd naturally assume that mountain was finished for good. But here's the twist, and it's a significant one. Reporting on the site found that even though a large majority of the visible tunnel entrances at Iran's underground missile bases had reportedly been struck, operations resumed quickly at most of them anyway. Construction. Equipment showed up within days. Debris got cleared away. Access roads that had been destroyed during the bombing runs were repaved. At one base, satellite imagery from a few months back showed roughly 10 separate construction vehicles working simultaneously to reopen a single blocked tunnel entrance. At another nearby site, engineers had already reopened 2 entrances that had previously been sealed shut by cratering. And by early this year, one satellite image caught a dump truck actively filling in the remaining bomb craters. Business as usual, almost as routine as any ordinary road repair crew. Analysts who reviewed the financial side of this entire campaign found something almost as striking as the imagery itself. Estimates built around just one phase of these bunker buster strikes against Iranian underground facilities put the total cost somewhere in the hundreds of millions of dollars, just for that single stretch of the effort. Compare that to what it actually costs to rent a handful of bulldozers and a dump truck for a week, and you start to understand exactly why this particular fight has turned into such a lopsided math problem. Some of the most expensive precision weapons on the planet were being used to create craters that a local construction crew could fill back in before the next strike package had even finished refueling. One resident living near that mountain described the whole situation about as plainly as anyone possibly could. They said they watched that mountain get bombed almost every single night, watched smoke rise into the sky, and then woke up the next morning to watch missiles get launched from that exact same mountain range all over again. Sit with that for a second. Nearly 20 strikes, collapsed entrances, secondary explosions, and missiles were still coming out of that mountain the very next morning, over and over, for months on end. Think honestly about what daily life even starts to look like for someone living under that kind of pattern. Explosions become background noise instead of an emergency. The bombing stops being the story and quietly starts becoming the weather. That's the part of this entire war that satellite photographs and official briefings can never really fully capture. The way an entire community near one of these sites has had to build a version of ordinary life around a nightly routine of bombardment that, by every visible measure, kept failing to actually stop what it was aimed at. So which is it really? Did American forces prove that underground weapons genuinely aren't safe? Or did Iran end up proving essentially the opposite? Honestly, based on everything in the available reporting, the answer seems to be both, depending entirely on exactly which target you happen to be looking at. And that's exactly where this story becomes genuinely interesting, because there's a very different example sitting right in the middle of this same war that teaches the complete opposite lesson. Earlier this summer, during a rescue operation for a downed American aircrew, a senior American military commander reportedly ordered a strike on an underground headquarters belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, located near the capital. According to multiple reports, the mission was carried out using the same heaviest class bunker busters that had been used against the earlier nuclear sites the year before, and the strike reportedly destroyed the headquarters outright. Other bombers dropped additional 2,000-pound bombs during that same rescue operation, aimed at pushing nearby ground forces away from the area while the recovery effort played out. Notice what's genuinely different about that specific mission compared to everything we just walked through at the Mountain Missile Complex. This wasn't a routine strike package slowly working down a long target list. This was a live, time-sensitive combat rescue with an American aircrew unaccounted for on the ground, and a senior combatant commander personally making the call in real time to bring the heaviest conventional bunker buster in the entire American arsenal onto one precise, already confirmed underground target. That's exactly the kind of intelligence-driven, time-sensitive strike this particular weapon was originally built for. One confirmed location, struck once, with total confidence in exactly what actually sat beneath the surface. Compare the two scenarios side by side for a moment. At the Mountain Missile Complex, the target was an entire mountain range full of interconnected tunnels, and the real intelligence problem was simply knowing which of dozens of entrances actually led somewhere important. Near the capital, the target was one specific building, already located, already confirmed, with an active rescue operation providing exactly the kind of urgency that pushes a commander to authorize the most expensive weapon available without a moment's hesitation. Same basic weapon, same underlying physics, two completely different outcomes, because the underlying intelligence picture was worlds apart in each case. That's not a mountain that got hit 20 times and kept functioning anyway. That's a single specific, high-value underground command node targeted once, with the heaviest bunker buster available and reportedly confirmed destroyed. So here's the actual pattern hiding underneath all of this, and I genuinely think it's the single most important thing to understand about this entire underground fight. Mass-produced tunnel networks, built specifically to store and move missiles, the kind that exist across dozens of sites throughout the country, have shown real, measurable resilience against repeated strikes because you simply cannot permanently seal an entire mountain with bomb craters when a country is willing to send in bulldozers within a matter of days. But single, high-value, precisely located targets, the kind intelligence has actually pinpointed with real confidence, appear to fall almost every single time the heaviest weapon in the arsenal gets pointed directly at them. Quantity beats precision when the target is spread across an entire mountain range. Precision beats depth when the target is one single, specific room. Think about it from the other side of this equation too, from inside an actual Iranian planning session. If you're the one deciding where to store your surviving missile stockpile after well over a year of sustained American bombing, the real lesson from that mountain complex isn't that underground storage doesn't work. It's that underground storage works exactly as long as you're willing to keep repairing it faster than the strikes keep coming. That's a genuinely sustainable strategy, right up until the exact moment American intelligence becomes specific enough to know precisely which room to hit, the way it apparently did with that Revolutionary Guard headquarters near the Capitol. So the actual arms race quietly happening underneath this entire war isn't really just about who can dig a deeper mountain. It's about whether Iran can keep its most important assets moving and indistinguishable from the rest of the wider network, faster than American intelligence can ever pin down which specific tunnel actually matters most. There's a genuine lesson buried in there for American military planners too, one that reaches well beyond just this one country. Every future adversary watching this war closely right now, and there are clearly several capitals doing exactly that, is learning the same two things simultaneously. Distributed, redundant, quickly repairable tunnel networks can absorb an enormous amount of precision firepower and keep functioning regardless. But once intelligence narrows down to one specific, high-confidence target, no amount of depth has reliably stopped the heaviest bunker buster from finishing the job. That's a lesson worth more to future military planning, on every side of every future conflict, than almost anything else that's come out of this particular war so far. And that's exactly why the newest, deepest facility in this entire story matters so much more than any single individual strike report. It isn't just Iran hiding equipment from one specific bomb. It's Iran, and quite possibly other governments watching from a safe distance, quietly running the actual math on exactly where the line currently sits between distributed resilience and precise defeat, and then building the next facility specifically on the far side of that line. Every war teaches the next one something. This particular underground fight, more than almost any other piece of this conflict, is teaching a lesson that clearly won't stay confined to just one country once it's fully learned. That brings us to the story still actively unfolding as of the most recent available reporting. According to daily tracking of this war, the nuclear file recently moved on two separate fronts at once, even though no nuclear facility itself was actually struck in the prior day's operations. Reports, citing Israeli and American officials, describe Iran transferring thousands of uranium enrichment centrifuges into a newly built underground complex sometime last autumn. Satellite imagery reportedly shows that site carved more than 100 meters, over 300 feet below solid bedrock. That's deeper than the original nuclear site that started this entire chapter of the story. That's a genuinely hard target, even for the most advanced bunker-penetrating weapons currently in the American arsenal. International nuclear inspectors have reportedly demanded answers about activity at that site, which has apparently never actually been inspected. Iranian officials maintain it's simply a centrifuge production and assembly facility, not an enrichment site, and they've denied any nuclear activity there as recently as this past week. That denial stands directly against a public warning from American officials that the complex could be struck if necessary. Sit with the reported name of that place for just a second, because even that isn't really a coincidence. It's apparently named essentially after the simplest possible hand tool it would take to dig it out manually, because no aircraft currently in service has been confirmed to reliably reach it from the air. That's not a subtle message buried in there. That's Iran effectively telling anyone paying close attention exactly how confident it is that this particular hole in the ground sits below the line American engineers have managed to solve for, at least so far. Let that sit with you for a moment. After the original nuclear strikes, after the missile tunnel campaign, after 20 strikes on one mountain complex, and a confirmed strike on an underground headquarters near the capital, Iran's actual response wasn't to give up on burying things deeper underground at all. It was to dig even deeper than before, specifically past the point where America's existing weapons are currently confirmed to reach. So let's talk honestly about what that actually means, because I think this is genuinely where the real strategic story lives, underneath every individual strike report. Every single time the United States demonstrates that it can reach one particular type of underground target, Iran's response isn't to stop hiding things underground entirely. It's to study exactly what worked against the previous facility and then build the next one specifically to avoid that same outcome. This newest, deepest complex, sitting well over 100 meters below bedrock, isn't an accident. Based on the reported timing, that transfer of centrifuges apparently began in autumn, months before this year's most intense bombing campaigns even started. That means Iranian planners were already working from the assumption that the depth of the original nuclear site, the exact depth America's heaviest bunker buster, was purpose-built to defeat, would eventually be exceeded by whatever the United States built next. They didn't wait around to find out. They simply went deeper first. While all of that has been unfolding underground, the war above ground clearly hasn't slowed down either. As of the most recent tracking available, forces reportedly completed another consecutive night of strikes against Iranian military command centers, drone storage facilities, communication networks, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities. Iranian media reported blasts in several locations, along with strikes near additional coastal islands. Local authorities in one province reported casualties from a separate missile strike, a necessary reminder that every one of these operations, underground or above it, carries a genuine human cost on the ground, even while the larger strategic chess match keeps playing out above it. Quick pause here, because if this kind of grounded, fact-checked breakdown is exactly what you come to this channel for, that's the entire reason it exists, So go ahead and hit subscribe, and let me know down in the comments which part of this story you want covered. Next, notice something about that recent target list too, because it's reportedly the first time in this particular phase of the campaign that command and control nodes were listed as leading the priority list, rather than trailing behind coastal and maritime targets. That shift matters, because it suggests military planners are increasingly focused on exactly the same lesson we just walked through underground. Distributed infrastructure can always be repaired. Command nodes, the specific rooms where actual decisions get made, cannot be rebuilt nearly as easily once the people and equipment inside them are gone. Above ground and below it, the pattern keeps pointing in the exact same direction. It's worth slowing down on that point for a moment, because it's easy to get completely pulled into the technology and the tunnel maps, and forget what's actually happening at ground level every single time one of these strikes lands. These aren't abstract facilities sitting empty somewhere on a map. People work in them, guard them, and live nearby. And in a number of these strikes, people have reportedly been killed and wounded doing exactly that. And whatever you personally think about the strategic necessity of any individual strike, that cost is genuinely real, and it doesn't show up in a satellite image of a crater. It shows up in a brief provincial casualty report that gets one line in a wire story before everyone moves on to the next night's target list. It's also worth remembering that this entire underground fight isn't happening in complete isolation from everything else going on around it. The same stretch of time these strikes were landing, the broader war was also expanding into entirely new fronts, from threats against Allied air bases to activity in nearby waterways, all while officials back home kept debating exactly how much longer they're willing to keep funding a campaign that clearly has no fixed end date attached to it. The underground fight is only one single layer of a much bigger structure, but it might genuinely be the layer that ends up deciding how the rest of it eventually plays out. Because as long as Iran believes it has a hole deep enough to protect what matters most, there's very little real incentive to negotiate any of the rest of it away. Now back to the strategic picture for a moment, because there's one more piece worth understanding before we wrap all of this up properly. Iran reportedly rejected a recent ceasefire proposal carried to Tehran through regional diplomatic channels, with Iranian officials indicating they simply aren't interested in negotiating on the terms currently being offered. That tells you something genuinely important about how Iran itself appears to be reading this entire underground war. If Tehran truly believed its buried infrastructure was on the verge of total collapse, you would reasonably expect far more urgency at the negotiating table, not less. Instead, the posture coming out of Iran right now looks a lot more like a country betting that its deepest facilities, the ones built specifically to sit below the reach of America's current bunker busters, will hold out long enough to simply outlast the war itself. It's a genuinely rational bet too, if you think about it honestly, from their side of the table. Every single negotiation carries a real cost, concessions on missile programs, on regional support, on enrichment limits, but every additional month spent digging deeper also carries its own cost, in resources and in exposure, while the transfer itself is actually happening. Still, if that newest complex really does sit beyond the reach of the current American arsenal, then Iran has effectively purchased itself real-time without giving up anything meaningful at the table at all. That's the calculation apparently being made in Tehran right now, whether or not it ultimately turns out to be correct. So where does that honestly leave things? Based on everything we've walked through today, here's the fair, honest picture. The United States has proven, beyond any real reasonable doubt, that it can locate and destroy a specific, high-value underground target when intelligence pinpoints it precisely enough, and that Revolutionary Guard headquarters strike near the capital is exactly that proof. But it has also learned the hard way, across roughly 20 separate strikes on a single mountain complex alone, that large, distributed tunnel networks can be seriously damaged without ever actually being permanently disabled, because concrete and bulldozers are genuinely cheap compared to the cost of the bombs used to crater them in the first place. And now, Iran has apparently responded to both of those lessons at once, by building something specifically designed to sit beyond the demonstrated reach of the very weapon that started this entire chapter of the story in the first place. That's really the core tension sitting underneath everything in this story. Did the United States prove that nothing buried underground is safe anymore? In at least one specific high-value case, yes, absolutely and unquestionably. But has it proven that everything Iran wants to protect is now fully within reach, based on that mountain complex's construction crews, and based on a facility literally named after the simplest tool it would take to dig it out by hand? The honest answer right now is not yet. And Iran appears to be actively betting its entire remaining nuclear program on that exact gap holding. So here's the real question I genuinely want you sitting with after this video ends. If that newest complex really does sit deeper than anything the current American bunker buster arsenal has been confirmed to defeat, Does that mean Iran has finally found the depth that actually wins this specific fight? Or does it just mean that whatever weapons program comes next already has its very first target picked out in advance? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments, because based on the pattern we've walked through today, repeating itself again and again, I genuinely don't think this is the last mountain we'll end up talking about. Before you go, one honest note worth saying plainly. Everything in this breakdown comes from cross-checking defense reporting and mainstream coverage against each other, and where different sources disagreed on a specific detail, like officials declining to confirm exactly which bomb was used at one particular site, that uncertainty was left in plainly, rather than filled in with a guess dressed up as settled fact. A story about weapons this powerful, aimed at targets buried this deep, genuinely deserves that level of care, especially when the honest answer is more complicated than any single headline could ever promise. And especially when the people actually living near these mountains, on every side of this war, deserve a version of this story that doesn't just tell them whatever sounds most dramatic. Thanks for sticking with me through the whole thing. I'll see you in the next one.